A crowd in Jerusalem bends down and picks up rocks. Not soldiers, not a mob that wandered in. Devout men. In the temple courts. They came to hear a teacher. Now they're looking for stones heavy enough to kill him with. He hasn't touched anyone. He hasn't led a revolt. He said one sentence. 7 words in English, 3 in Greek. And here's the thing I want you to hold for the next 20 minutes. Nobody stones a good teacher. Whatever they heard in that sentence, they'd heard something they believed carried the death penalty. And they weren't confused people. They were experts. So we don't have to guess what he claimed. We can read the claim off the reaction. Before any of the evidence, you need the world this happened in, because without it, every quote in this episode lands wrong. First century Judea wasn't a place with loose opinions about God. The central confession of Jewish faith is one line, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. A devout Jew said it daily. It wasn't a doctrine you held. It was the border of your whole identity. The nation had spent centuries conquered, exiled, and occupied rather than give it up. So blasphemy wasn't rudeness about God. It was a capital charge with a defined shape. And here's the part almost everyone gets wrong. Claiming to be the Messiah was not blasphemy. It wasn't even unusual. Several men made that claim in that century. Some got followings. Some got killed by Rome as political nuisances. Not one of them got a religious court tearing its clothes. The Messiah, in most Jewish expectation, was a man, an anointed king. Claiming to be him made you a rebel, not a blasphemer. So watch what happens around Jesus. A crowd reaching for stones. A court convened at night. A high priest tearing his robes, and every time the same specific charge, blasphemy. That's people responding to something well past a messianic claim. Now the other half of the frame, and this is where both skeptics and believers usually go looking in the wrong place. People hunt for a verse where Jesus says, "I am God," in those 3 words. You won't find it phrased that way, and you shouldn't expect to. That's like faulting a first-century Jew for not writing in English. He's speaking Aramaic, inside a Jewish thought world with its own vocabulary for divinity. 3 centuries before anyone wrote a creed. Expecting later language from an earlier world has a name. It's called anachronism, and in this argument, it's the single most common mistake made on both sides. So we're going to do it the way a historian would. Watch what he does, watch what he quotes, and watch what the room does back. Capernaum, a crowded house. 4 men can't get a paralyzed friend through the door, so they go up on the roof, dig through it, and lower him down. Everybody in that room's expecting a healing. Instead, Jesus looks at the man and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And the religious scholars sitting there react instantly. Mark records what they're thinking, and it's the whole argument in one line. Why does this man speak like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Sit with what they just did. They didn't object that he was wrong about this man's sins. They objected that forgiving them wasn't his to do. Here's the logic they're running, and it's good logic. If you wrong me, I can forgive you. Nobody else can do that on my behalf, but every sin is ultimately against God, so only God can clear the account. And Jesus is standing in Capernaum settling debts that are owed to somebody else. That's charge number 1. And notice the shape because it repeats. They told us what they heard. 1 charge is an incident. 4 is a pattern. Back to the stones. Jesus is arguing in the temple courts, and the crowd throws Abraham at him. Abraham is the floor of Jewish identity. Who do you think you are? Are you greater than our father Abraham? And Jesus answers, before Abraham was, I am. To us, that's a grammar error. To them, it's a lit match. 2 things are happening in 4 words. The first is the tense. Abraham came into being. Jesus says, I am. He isn't claiming to be older than Abraham. He's claiming a different kind of existence than Abraham had. The second is the phrase itself. In Greek, it's ego eimi, I am, standing alone with nothing after it. That construction isn't ordinary. It's the phrase that shows up when God names himself. Moses at the burning bush asks who he should say sent him, and the answer is, I am has sent you. And in Isaiah, when God distinguishes himself from every idol, the refrain is, I am he. So Jesus takes the sentence God uses for himself and finishes a sentence about Abraham with it. And the crowd picks up rocks. In the temple. Immediately. They didn't need a commentary. They knew exactly which sentence he had just borrowed. And I want to slow down on something that's easy to skate past. Nobody handed Jesus those words. In every one of these scenes, he's the one reaching into the Hebrew scriptures and pulling out a passage, and the ones he reaches for are about God, not about God's servants. There were plenty of humbler options on the table. He could have quoted the prophets, who spoke for God and were careful to say so. He could have taken the language of Moses, greatest figure in the tradition and still only ever a man. Those roles existed, they were honorable, they were safe. He doesn't use them. He keeps selecting the texts where the subject is God himself. That's not a category the crowd was confused about, and it isn't a category he could have wandered into by accident. Think about how narrow that is. The Hebrew scriptures are enormous. They're full of language for kings, judges, priests, prophets, and messengers. Every honorable role a man could claim, with vocabulary already built for it. He walks past all of it. Every time, he reaches for the shelf marked God. That's not a man being misunderstood, that's a man being precise. Here's the test that keeps this from becoming a word association game. A prophet can say, God has healed this man. A king can say, God has sent me. A priest can say, God will forgive you. Those are delegated roles. The question is whether Jesus keeps stepping over the line between speaking for God and doing what belongs to God. The rooms don't react to a title, they react to a prerogative. That distinction is the whole case. If you only remember one scene from this episode, make it this one. Here the crowd removes all doubt about what they heard. Winter, Solomon's colonnade. Jesus is talking about his followers, and he says, I and the Father are one. Stones again, same reaction, same courtyard. But this time Jesus stops them and asks a question. And the question is, why this scene matters more than the others. He says, I've shown you many good works from the Father. For which one are you stoning me? And they answer him, out loud, on the record. We are not stoning you for any good work, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. That's no scholar's inference 2,000 years later. That's the hostile party, in the moment, stating the charge in plain words. They're the people with the least interest in reading him generously. And they're telling us exactly what they understood him to be doing. They told us what they heard. 4 words. And they're the reason this question is more settled than people think. There's a 5th one, and it comes before the stones. Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath and gets challenged for working on the day of rest. His defense isn't that the man needed help. His defense is, my Father is working until now, and I am working. Read that as his critics did. He isn't appealing to a rule. He's claiming the one exemption in the universe. God doesn't stop upholding creation on Saturday. So if Jesus works when God works, he's putting himself on God's side of a line no rabbi would go near. And John tells us exactly how it landed. They tried all the harder to kill him because he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. That's the second time the hostile party states the charge in plain words. Not a hint, a charge. And notice where that one sits. John chapter 5 is early in the book, long before the confrontations we just walked through. The pattern isn't a crescendo somebody built toward. It's there from the start, and it keeps producing the same reaction. Now I've got to stop and hand the other side the microphone. If I run past this, you should stop trusting me. There's a serious scholarly case that he never claimed it, and it isn't made by cranks. Art Ehrman argues it in How Jesus Became God, and he's a real historian doing real history. Here it is at full strength. Move 1. Look at where those quotes came from. The stones, the temple. Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. Every single one is from John's Gospel. John is our latest Gospel, written perhaps 60 years after the crucifixion by people who'd already spent decades worshiping Jesus. The earlier Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, are noticeably quieter. Jesus doesn't walk around those books announcing divine identity. Move 2. That's exactly the pattern you'd expect if the belief grew rather than started. Earliest sources, modest claims. Latest source, the loudest claims. That's not what an accurate memory looks like. That's what a developing tradition looks like. Move 3. Every one of the reactions I've shown you is reported by the same people making the claim. Christian authors wrote down both the sentence and the outrage. If you're already convinced he's divine, writing a scene where his enemies conceded is the most natural thing in the world. And Ehrman would add something fair about the ancient world itself. The line between human and divine was blurrier then than it is for us. There were exalted figures, angels, and heavenly intermediaries. So a first-century Jew hearing a big claim wasn't necessarily hearing what you'd hear.
That's the case. It's coherent. It explains real features of the evidence. And I'm not going to answer it yet.
Because while that objection is sitting there, there's a habit running quietly through all four Gospels that nobody in the story ever explains. People fall down in front of Jesus, and he lets them. The Greek word is proskuneo. It covers a range, bowing to a king, prostrating before a superior, worshiping God. And I'll be straight with you, that range is exactly why some translations say worshipped and others say knelt. That ambiguity is real, and I'm not going to pretend it away.
But watch what makes the pattern strange anyway.
Everywhere else in this literature, when a creature receives that posture, they refuse it, and they refuse it fast. In Acts, a crowd at Lystra starts treating Paul and Barnabas as gods. They tear their clothes and run in shouting that they're only men. In Revelation, John falls at an angel's feet, and the angel stops him cold. Don't do that. I'm a fellow servant. Worship God. That's the reflex. A monotheist who receives worship corrects it fast, because letting it stand is the sin. Jesus never corrects it. Not with the leper, not with the disciples in the boat, not with the women at the tomb. A movement of strict monotheists remembered their teacher receiving the posture they'd been trained since childhood to refuse, and remembered him letting it stand. Which brings us to the night it all came due. Jesus is on trial. The court's been at it for hours and nothing's sticking. Witnesses keep contradicting each other. A case built on contradicting witnesses collapses. The high priest's running out of night. So he stands up and asks it straight. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus answers with a sentence that has two Old Testament texts fused inside it. I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, and coming with the clouds of heaven. Two quotations, welded together, both chosen by him. The first is Psalm 110. Sit at my right hand. In a royal court, that seat has an occupant, and it's not a prophet. The second is Daniel chapter 7. A figure comes with the clouds of heaven, receives everlasting dominion, and is served by all nations. In the Hebrew scriptures, riding the clouds is something God does, and the word served there is the word used for religious service, to God. So he takes the throne text and the cloud rider text and puts them in one sentence about himself. The high priest tears his robes. That's not temper. It's the formal legal signal that the courts heard blasphemy. And a trial that had gone nowhere all night ends immediately. So, back to the objection I left standing, because it deserves an actual answer and not a shrug. The strongest point was the John problem. The loudest claims live in the latest gospel, and that's true. But watch what happens when you take John away entirely. You still have Mark chapter 2, where he forgives sins, and the scribes say only God can do that. You still have the worship he never corrects. And you still have the trial in Mark, our earliest gospel. He fuses Psalm 110 to Daniel 7, and the court convicts him on the spot. The pattern doesn't live in John. John states it most explicitly. The pattern is in the earliest material we have, and it's in the reactions, which is the part that's hardest to invent. But I want to hand Ehrman something back, because he's earned it, and because a way-in that only takes isn't a way-in. He's right that the Gospels get louder. That development is real, and it isn't a nuisance to be explained away. Mark is more restrained than John. Any honest reading has to account for that, instead of waving at it. Something did grow here. The church spent decades finding language for what it was already doing, and John is where that language finally arrives. So the question isn't whether there was development. There was. The question is whether the thing being put into words was there at the start or manufactured at the end. Which brings me to the argument I find hardest to get around, and it's a question rather than a claim. They killed him. Why? Rome crucified him, and Rome doesn't care about Jewish theology. But he was handed to Rome by a Jewish court that had convicted him of blasphemy. And a good teacher doesn't get that charge. A healer doesn't. A social reformer doesn't. Even a messianic claimant doesn't. That's a Roman problem, not a blasphemy trial. The charge only fits if the court believed he was claiming something that belonged to God alone. They had every reason to want a lesser charge. A lesser charge is easier to prove and less dangerous to bring. They went with the one that required a divine claim. Now let me be careful and label this properly. What's solid and granted across the field, believing and skeptical alike? Jesus was executed after a Jewish hearing on a blasphemy charge. The earliest Christians worshipped him as divine astonishingly fast, inside a monotheism with every reason to refuse. And the reactions recorded against him are consistently reactions to a divine claim, not a moral one. What's contested, and I'll say it plainly, whether Jesus, in his own voice, made an explicit claim to deity is still argued by serious historians. Ehrman reads it one way. Bauckham and Hurtado read it another. Both are doing real history, and anyone who tells you the Guild has settled this is overselling. Where I land, and this is a judgment, not a proof. Take the 5 reactions, the text he chose for himself, the worship he never corrected, and the charge they finally killed him on. Each one alone can be explained away. All of them together take a lot of explaining. The cumulative case is strong. It's not a mathematical proof, and I'm not going to dress it up as one. And here's what would move me the other way, because you should always ask that. If the blasphemy charge turned out to be a later Christian addition to the trial scene, if the earliest layer of Mark showed a Jesus who corrects people for kneeling, or if a first-century Jewish text turned up showing that ordinary rabbis got stoned for this kind of language routinely. None of those is what we find. But those are the shapes of evidence that would change my mind, and if I couldn't name any, you'd be right to discount everything I just said. Which is exactly where a famous argument comes in, and where it needs a repair. C.S. Lewis put it in one line. A man who said the things Jesus said is not available to you as merely a great moral teacher. He's either a liar, or a lunatic, or he's Lord. Pick one. Critics have hammered that for decades, and they've got a real point. Lewis left a 4th door open. Legend. Maybe he never claimed it, and his followers said it for him later. Then he's not lying, not insane, and not God. He's been embellished. That objection's correct, as an objection to Lewis. He assumed the claim instead of establishing it. But notice what this episode has been doing for the last 18 minutes. We've been closing that 4th door, the forgiveness in Mark, the worship he never corrected, the trial in our earliest gospel, the charge they killed him on. That's the floor Lewis skipped, laid down piece by piece. And with the floor in place, the trilemma stands back up. If he made those claims, then a merely great teacher option isn't on the table. Great moral teachers don't take worship. They don't forgive sins owed to God. The kindest thing you can say about a man who does that, if he isn't what he says, is that he's unwell. So the question narrows to exactly where Lewis wanted it. Not was he nice. Who did he think he was, and was he right? That last step is a faith claim, not a lab result, and I'll always tell you which is which. History can hand you the stones, the torn robes, and the charge. It can't walk you through that door. But it's worth noticing who walked through first. Not the most credulous disciple, Thomas, the one who said he wouldn't believe it without seeing the wounds himself. He got his evidence. And what he said was, "My Lord and my God." So the next time somebody tells you he never claimed it, you don't need a proof text. You've got something better. You've got 4 rooms full of people who were there. A house in Capernaum, where scholars said only God can forgive. A temple courtyard, twice, where devout men reached for stones and then said why. And a courtroom at night, where a high priest tore his own clothes. They told us what they heard. And nobody stones a good teacher. Sources are in the description. Subscribe if this was useful. One hard question, weighed honestly, every week. Keep watching for the light.